All right, so it's Song of Songs Day. So we're going to sing the song. We're not going to literally sing the song. You wouldn't want that really. But we're going to try to keep unpacking the dove's eyes from last week. And when I walked back in here, I'd gone to get something to eat before class. And I walked back in, and I looked out my window, and there was a pair of doves right under the window. And they kind of looked up at me like, and they flew away, but they did say hi. And that seems to be my thing. Wherever I go, I seem to run into doves of all colors. So I'm not sure what that means, but I had fun doing the dove lesson for today. So let me share the screen with you. Now that we've stopped the concert. And I think, like, I know we're off a lesson in our numbering, but I just decided rather than vex myself any more than I already had, that I would just persist with what I think I've got figured out, knowing that I think what happened is we loaded a Song of Song lesson in with a Torah portion lesson. And so I think that accounts for the misnumbering. At any rate, this is going to be lesson 30. And I'll try to keep better track of what lesson we're on, or why at least it might look like it's off. So here we go. And here's the verse that we're working with today. It's chapter 1, verse 15. I know it's unbelievable how long we've been in chapter 1, but we're almost done. We will, B'ezrat Hashem, we will finish this chapter next week, and then we will go into chapter 2. It seems like chapter 1 was packed more than any other with information, especially information that we would be particularly interested in. I couldn't believe how much the lost tribes kept coming up, and the exile kept coming up, and the regathering from the exile came up. And it's no different in the commentary on this verse. And so our verse is, "How beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves." And I've heard several different renditions of this verse as a song, and it always comes out sounding very mystical, as music goes. There's upbeat and there's kind of sad or whatever. This particular verse is a song. It seems like the artist always, what the music that they choose for the lyrics is very mystical. And if I can remember next week, I'll play you a song by one particular artist. Hinach Yafa, Enaich Yoni. You're beautiful, your eyes are like dove's eyes. And from last week, what we saw was that each source of beauty was thought to be a mitzvah. It was thought to be a commandment that she had put on, that at the receiving of the commandments at Sinai at the time of Shavuot, that she was given the opportunity to beautify herself, not just with the garments of glory, but also with what we would say is the jewelry of glory, the jewelry of eternity, like Adi, when Moses says, "Take off your Adi," after they sin with the golden calf. It's kind of a way of saying, take off not just the signs that you're a bride, but take off your eternity. You're not ready to move into eternity in the condition that you're in. It would have been nice, Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden because the Father didn't want them to take of the tree of life and then live forever in sin in the garden. He doesn't want us to live in sin perpetually. The problem is sometimes that's exactly what we want. We never want to stop sinning. And that's the great battle that the Torah has to fight with us, to take away that daily desire that we have to do something, because we desire to continue living basically a half life. A life of mortality is only a half life. The life that we were created to live is a whole life in the garden. And this restoration of the whole life, of the resurrection life, we get this by being able to put on the commandments, because these are the things we're just going to have to live with. I know there's commandments we love, and then there's commandments we not so much love because they're more difficult for us. And we have to take on his attitude about them. And when we take on his attitude about the commandments, it's a beautiful thing in the Father's eyes, because he can see that we are putting on the garments and the ornaments of eternity. He can see that we don't want to live forever a half life, half in goodness and half in evil. And so the eyes of the dove, that's what we want to look at today. And we ended last week with, you are beautiful in this world, and you are beautiful in the world to come. I want to start from there, because what we're doing in this world is not disconnected from the beauty that we will have in the world to come. That's what I mean about putting on the mitzvah, putting on the commandments as adornments, as jewelry, signifying to the Father that we don't want half life, that we want whole life in the garden. And that beauty must be put on now. If we want that to be an enduring beauty, that will be rewarded with more beauty in the world to come. See, that's the thing. Adonai always recompenses, it's called midah keneged midah. And that basically means measure against measure. In English, we would say probably measure for measure. Quid pro quo. You've heard that phrase before. And so if you do evil, then you're going to receive a commensurate reward. But if you do the mitzvot of beauty in this world, then you are also rewarded with beauty in the world to come. Waiting for the world to come is not the time to start thinking about the things of beauty in his word. It's not the time to say, oh yeah, we're in the next life here. Let's start thinking about, what God wants instead of what I want. There's a beauty that you can acquire there, but he doesn't reward you. It's not a reward. It's like putting on the essentials that you're going to have to learn to exist in that place. But it's in this life that we have the chance to acquire, to put on the beauty of Yeshua, the beauty of the word. And then when we move into the next world, he gives us more. He rewards us with more of what we invested in. If we invested in his beauty in this life, then he rewards us with more beauty in the next, if that makes sense. So it says the beauty that can be acquired through mitzvot in this world is more valued than any performed in the next. It's only here that reward is earned and carried into the next. And I'm using Revelation 14:13 this is coming out of the Midrash. I'm thinking, is there anything in the apostolic writings that would bear witness to that concept? And that took me to Revelation 14:13. It says, I heard a voice from heaven saying, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. In other words, those little deeds are going to follow you into heaven whether you like it or not. And so those deeds following after you, there's going to be a rest from the labor there. Things are going to be so much easier than they are right now. But there's a blessing for those who die in the Lord. It doesn't say there's a blessing for those who die from their own stupidity, who die in their own desire to live a half life. But for those who desire to live a whole life and whose deeds demonstrate that they desire to live that whole life with Him, then their deeds are going to follow after them. They will penetrate into that other realm because they're deeds of beauty. And the reward, again, is going to be more beauty. You can acquire even more beauty than you ever imagined. And the beauty of the dove, it is said, carried it into the garden to retrieve the olive leaf as a sign to Noah. I think we had a lesson on this before, where we talked about where the olive leaf that the dove brought back to Noah was actually brought back from the Garden of Eden. And it says, just as doves and pigeons, remember, these are the two types of birds that are eligible for a sacrifice for sin. These are the offerings of a very poor person. And there's a great message here. When we look at somebody who is so poor, they would have to bring a turtle dove or a pigeon as a sacrifice. It's also a picture of the fact that we are in a state of want for physical things. A poor person may not have much in the bank account. A poor person may not have a great home, a beautiful car, or a camel or donkey or whatever. The poor person still has lack. And so there's still room for someone to pour into that person. In this case, the Holy One wants to pour into that place. And in that case, being rich or poor has nothing to do with how much money you have. It has to do with how much space you make for Him. Because if you have everything, if you're full of yourself, then it's very hard for you to make space to hear either the word itself, as you study the word itself, or hear the voice of others.
I got 3 boys with Monday birthdays.
Oh yeah, they're all 3 in our class. Wow.
But I guess
Okay, I think I found it. Let's see, who do I have on here that can do that for me right now? Let's see, Colleen, can you check the hot mics for me?
Yes, sure, Elisa. Fine.
Okay, thank you. I should have done that at the beginning. I forget. I get excited. Okay, so talking about the dove and the pigeon as the sacrifice for the poor person. That's why they're such a beautiful symbol, because the poor person represents the person who has made space for the Holy One. There's still something left for the poor person to learn. There's still something left for the poor person to receive. You know, it talks about meekly receiving the engrafted word. And so without that meekness, without that humility symbolized by the dove or the pigeon, then you're just too rich really to work on those qualities that would bring you the richness of heaven. You're still a little tied up in the half-life, because if there's that much of yourself, if there's so much of yourself that you're filled up and you can't receive, then there's a good chance that it's your own beauty that you're working on. It's not a way of beautifying yourself with the commandments to glorify the Holy One and to enrich his kingdom. Instead, you're probably more focused on you and your kingdom, even if somehow you think it fits into his. You spend more time working on your personal kingdom than reflecting the glory back to him. And so the dove and the pigeon makes a wonderful, wholesome sacrifice. And even though the dove or the pigeon is going to be the smallest of all the sacrifices, as far as a living animal, it's also, they're very beautiful. Doves and pigeons come in all colors. They do tend to have beautiful eyes. When those doves looked up at me when I went up to the window, they're very expressive. They're talking to you. So they do have beautiful eyes, and it mentions their gait, that they have a very stately gait. You know, when you watch some birds walking, it's almost comical. They just kind of hop around, but when you watch a dove or a pigeon walk, it's very stately. And it says that these represent the people of Israel because their eyes are very expressive. You can see who they are reflected in their eyes. And we know that if you've done workbook 1 of Creation Gospel, you know that eyes are one of the symbols of the Spirit. And so what a dove has is the eyes or the spirit of acceptable sacrifice. I've got one sitting up there looking at me right now. Ma'am or sir, whoever you are. I don't think he's volunteering to be a sacrifice though. But this is the quality of the dove or the poor person. They know how to sacrifice because they sacrifice from having so little. A rich person, when they give money, when they tithe or they give a gift or whatever, it doesn't mean that gift is unimportant. It is. But if they have plenty, the personal cost to the rich person will be less painful than it is to the poor person who might have to scrape just to get the dove or the pigeon, or just enough meal, enough for the grain offering. And so the lesson here, whether you're physically rich or poor in this life, the lesson to take is from the dove. No matter how much money we have in our bank account, it's important to have the humility of the dove, to leave that empty space of a poor man in our soul, because Yeshua said, blessed are those who.
You shut the door, please.
There's a reason he's saying they're blessed, because the poor person has made space to receive. And that's what we want. We always want to leave space to receive, to greet people with that expressive look of the Spirit, to say that, if today's the day I need to sacrifice, then I'll go. And they say that the dignity of these birds in the face of sacrifice, not in any other way. Apparently, they observed the habits of birds more closely than we do today, because they did have, animal sacrifices. And they said that in the temple, the attitude of the doves or the pigeons who were brought in for the temple sacrifices is they basically gave up. When their necks were stretched out, they didn't flop around, thrash around, struggle. Instead, they would just kind of go limp and accept the sacrifice. And that's what would maybe set them apart from, say, sacrificing a chicken or an owl or an eagle. Other birds are just not so accepting of that sort of fate. But for these two birds, their ability to sacrifice, it was not as if their life was being taken from them. It was as if they were giving up their lives. Now, is that true outside of the temple? I don't know. I've never, tried to snap the neck off a living bird before. I've been bird hunting, but so I don't know how it would be if they were still alive. But this is what we have coming down from the tradition. And they associate this beautiful gait of the pigeon and the dove when they walk. They associate this with the way that the Israelites walk and ascend to the pilgrimage festivals. And they make the point that even when the temple doesn't stand, there are those who exert and sacrifice themselves to walk into the holy city, because it says they have the eyes of doves who ascend to the garden. Even though maybe the dove knew that mankind at that point still was not going to be able to ascend to the garden, she still goes and she gets that olive branch. And she takes it back to Noah as an encouragement, even though we're still living half lives. Let's go ahead and beautify ourselves with obedience, because one day we will. And the dove represents this in that stately gait. And it's saying those who will put forth an effort and sacrifice themselves. That's the thing with the dove. You have to keep thinking of the word sacrifice when you think of the dove, a sacrificial life. That's why they are the sacrifices of birds in the temple. You even see them in the covenant between the pieces. They sacrifice themselves to walk into the holy city. So if you have ever sacrificed yourself in some way in order to go to Jerusalem at the feasts, in order to go to Israel, to connect with that homeland, even though there's no temple to go to, they say that is a most pleasing sacrifice, and it's the most beautiful of walks. When the pilgrims walk into the holy city, it's the most beautiful, stately, dignified walk that pleases the Father. They make another point about the dove. I know we remember Yeshua saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how many times I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." And then we've got those commandments about not taking a chick away from the mother bird when she's sitting on her nest. You have to wait and make sure that they're separated, that they're not within sight of one another. And Messiah is kind of saying, if you would have gathered to me at the feasts, if you would have gathered to that living word at the appointed times, you would have been protected. I could have protected you, because the law of the universe itself says that you can't be taken from the mother bird. It says, but you would not. And so that's the idea. If we stay close to Yeshua, if we stay in close fellowship with the Father, if we go up at the appointed times, then, that's what the word says. If you'll go up at the appointed times, I'll protect your property while you're away. Don't worry about your job. Don't worry about your property. Don't worry about, your donkeys getting out. Don't worry about those things. If you'll just trust me, if you'll walk to the holy city, if you'll make that pilgrimage festival, then I will watch over your physical treasury, just as you're watching over your spiritual treasury as you make this walk that's commanded. It says, just as the dove, even if you do take her young from beneath her, she never leaves her dovecote. So the people of Israel did not leave the 3 yearly festivals, even though the temple was destroyed. So the analogy is there, if you did take the young away from a dove who's made a home in a dovecote, she won't fly around now that the young are gone. She said, well, the kids are out of the house, empty nest syndrome. I'm going to go move to Las Vegas or something. That's not what the dove does. She stays right there at her home. And so when the temple was removed from the holy city, when the Israelites and the Jews, when they were removed from the Holy Land, nevertheless, they didn't just fly off and adopt the holidays of other nations. Instead, they maintained their 3 yearly festivals. Even though there was no temple to go to, nevertheless, they maintained those 3 yearly festivals. So the faithfulness of the dove is seen in Israel and in her eyes. Remember, the eyes are the spirit. She has a spirit of faithfulness. And so she maintains those festivals. It's one of my favorite pictures. I like it when people look up in Jerusalem. It also makes the point, and I don't know whether the number is right, but it says a human being has 248 limbs, and they all come and go after the eyes. In other words, whatever your eyes see, that's where your body is going to go. It says, while the nations follow after their eyes and turn to idols of created things, Israel follows her eyes and pursues her beloved Creator. The dove is faithful, as she was to Noah, and Israel is faithful to her Creator, for her eyes are wholesome. In other words, the things that you see with your eyes don't become a distraction to you. You keep your eyes focused on your Creator, on His word. You're faithful to that word. And so where other people run to and fro to multiple idols, you might say that it's whatever feels good in the moment. That's the idol of the moment. The dove is not like that. She's faithful. And even if it's difficult, like apparently it was for this dove to go get this olive leaf, nevertheless, she's going to be faithful to that mission because she knows the garden is the goal. I think I already mentioned that the dove and the pigeon did not fight their sacrifice like the chickens or the birds of prey in the temple when they were sacrificed in the temple. Instead, Psalm 44:23 describes it like this. The way that the dove would stretch out her net for slaughter. It says, because for your sake, we are killed all the time. So as the dove was killed every day in the temple as sacrifice, in the same way, Israel is going to have to be like that dove, and they are going to have to be killed all the time as well. It's going to happen if we don't follow after our eyes into idolatry. If we keep our eyes on the garden and on the Creator, then we will be slaughtered. That's part of the deal. We will have to give up those impulses that draw us here and there and away from that straight path that we were talking about last night. The dove was one of the sacrifices, again, as it pertains to a poor person. The dove could atone for sin. And they made a reference there. What they're going to do is tie the dove into Israel's mission to the nations. Because she's the sacrificial bird, and because the attitude of sacrifice, the attitude of poverty, that's a prerequisite for atoning for sin, then looking at the dove is going to help us make this connection to what the people of Israel were put on this earth to do. What was their mission? Well, it was to sacrifice. To sacrifice for what? to sacrifice in order to bring people back to their creator so that they would quit following after their eyes and their idols, and they would instead focus their eyes on their creator. So they say when the temple stood, of course, we know at Sukkot, Israel would offer 70 bulls and they would pray on behalf of the nations. And each year this would bring an atonement for the nations so that they could receive rain and survive. Last night we talked about the importance of Israel's behavior in the land if they wanted to receive rain, because it was like heaven on earth. There's a close relationship to heaven, to the Garden of Eden, which is called the third heaven. There's a close relationship between the third heaven and the literal land of Israel. And the relationship is so close, he says, like the days of heaven on earth, that if you disobeyed the commandments, then it would stop the rain. The rain could not respond to disobedience and rebellion. In the same way, Israel was to be that light to the nations. They were to also pray on behalf of the nations so they could receive the rain that they needed and survive. Even though they were working on a different formula, nevertheless, the nations needed the proper amount of rain, not too much, not too little, at the proper season. And so each year at Sukkot, they would offer these 70 bulls and pray for the nations so that the nations would not perish from the earth. The nations serve a function. And the month of Tishrei, the 7th month, is the time of judgment, when it's decreed, when it's determined where the rain will fall and if it will be destructive. Whereas as Israel goes into the land, they understand that particular relationship they have with the land of Israel. Because it's so closely connected to the garden, Zechariah prophesies of a time when the nations as well will have to come up at Sukkot. They will have to bring their own sacrifices up at Sukkot. The same conditions that were imposed upon Israel in terms of their behavior, it's now going to be extended around the world. And so here's what Zechariah says, and you're familiar with this passage, chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. It says, "Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of armies, and to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. And it will be that whichever the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of armies, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations that do not go up to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to celebrate the feast of Sukkot." And you can see the equivalency of expression there between Egypt and the nations. Egypt is symbolic of the nations themselves. And in that pairing, we kind of get where Israel was when they were slaves in Egypt. They were slaves among the nations, surrounded with darkness, surrounded with idols. So, the fact that they were able to maintain who they were as a nation and not just completely dissolve, straying after their eyes to follow idols, it tells you that even though they had fallen to some severe levels of impurity, nevertheless, they still had the dove's eyes. They still recognized in Moses and Aaron deliverance. They still realized that, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was concerned about them, and that he was going to make this reconnection with them. So the unique relationship that Israel has with the land itself, you can see this goes worldwide. I would think in the time of the millennium, is Israel still offering 70 bulls on the behalf of the nations? I don't know. It looks to me like this is taking the place of, rather than offer the 70 bulls, now the nations have to come up. themselves and offer their own prayers. Maybe it's both. I don't know. Gam v'gam, they say in Hebrew. The dove might travel long distances to search for food. But like we said, her habit is to return to her nest. Like we have homing pigeons. Homing pigeons will even do their job in a war setting. World wars past, they would use homing pigeons to send messages because they knew that they were faithful to return to that same nest or that same dovecote. In Hosea 11, 10 through 11, it talks about the people of Israel who were going to stir like a bird from Egypt. And we just saw back here in Zechariah that he's drawing an equivalency between Egypt and the nations. So when we get over here in Hosea or Hosea, when it says they will stir like a bird from Egypt, we can also read into it, they will stir like a bird in the nations, out from among the nations. The Midrash says this is an allusion to the generation of the wilderness. It's a generation that came out from the nations, that came out from Egypt. And then it pairs it with another prophecy that says, and like a dove from the land of Assyria. And then it clarifies. It says, these are the 10 tribes. And regarding both the generation of the wilderness and the 10 tribes, the passage concludes, and I will settle them in their homes. So the rabbinic commentary, again, kind of astounds me. I had just never seen them as being that concerned with where the 10 tribes were, but it is so much a part of their prophetic expectation. And I can see now more clearly why, 2,000 years, we were talking about the days of Messiah last week, what he has been doing out here among the nations. Because of Yeshua, this message went to the nations. Because of Yeshua, so many have turned their eyes away from idolatry and back to the creator of the universe, back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're not saying there aren't still problems. Absolutely, there are still problems. But we're talking about something that has spread across the entire world. It has spread all over Egypt, we might say, among the nations. And they're making the comparison here. They say, when this happens, when Israel is stirred from the land of Assyria, okay, Assyria that was the last known destination of the 10 tribes. And so it also has a symbolic value as a place, the nations where they disappeared among the nations. Just like Egypt represents nations, Assyria, when you say Assyria, where did the lost 10 tribes go? Well, they went to Assyria. They went out into the nations. We don't know where they went. We can trace them so far, but at some point, it's no point doing a genealogy because the nations have intermarried so much. I don't think you're going to find one little spot on earth and say, oh, we found the 10 tribes. It sounds to me as though the intent was to mix them out there in all the earth. So it says, these are the 10 tribes, and regarding both the generation of the wilderness and the 10 tribes, the passage concludes, I will settle them in their homes. So it's making the analogy that these last 10 tribes of Israel, they've been sent out to Egypt, they've been sent out to Assyria, and they're going to be like doves. At some point, they're going to go back to that dovecote. They're like the homing pigeons. At some point, their eyes are going to turn back toward Jerusalem and say, oh, that's my home. They're going to start going back to the land of Israel. And, we've read the prophecies in, I think it's Jeremiah, where it says, who are these? Where did these come from? Who has begotten me these? They will return like doves to their lattices. like they remember somehow in their spirit is stirred. Remember, eyes represent the spirit. They are stirred in their eyes and they look back toward the land and they say, oh, I've got to go back there. There's something inside of me that's just, I don't understand how it works. It's not a switch that I consciously turn off and on. It's like the spirit has turned on, has disturbed something within me until I recognize that that is my home. And I want to start flying there. And it says in this midrash that this prophecy from Hosea is a promise that these 10 tribes of Israel will be brought back to the land from whatever nation they were sent to, and they will be settled in their homes, their original homes. And then it adds this, it says, for the people of Israel were exiled great distances from their homeland, but will eventually return. This passage, the one from Hosea, proves that the Israelites travel to distant lands, but like the dove, they will eventually come home. They are veritable homing pigeons who return unerringly to their original nests, which is pretty cool. I mean, let's go back here. Let's look at this picture. Those are birds. You see all the doves and the pigeons right there in Jerusalem? That's what they're doing. They're returning home because they've been stirred to come back home. So Genesis 8:11 says the dove came back to Noah in the evening, and behold, an olive leaf within its beak. And by the way, don't ever eat an olive leaf, and don't ever eat a raw olive. They don't taste good. They are bitter. They start out bitter. All right. It's only after a lot of pressure and work when you obtain the olive oil that it's going to have a pleasant taste to it. So what the dove is bringing back, when she brings back this raw product of an olive leaf, she's bringing back something that would be bitter. But she's credited with bringing light back into the world. Because by bringing the olive leaf, she's bringing this promise again of the oil. It's the olive oil with which you generate light. And so it's the midrash where it talks about where she brought this olive leaf. It says the dove brought the olive leaf from the shoots of Eretz Yisrael. The gates of the Garden of Eden were opened up for the dove, and from there it brought the olive leaf. And so olive oil is what was used to power the holy menorah. And you can see why Yeshua would want to pass the night in the garden of Gat Shemen. That would be the olive press or the oil press. Shemen is oil. Out there among those olive trees, he's surrounded by a reminder, again, of what is the point of this. The point, like we were looking at last night when he cried out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And how that fits into the hours and what was expected within those certain hours of the day. I think by going into an olive garden, not the restaurant, he would be surrounded with these reminders as he prayed that this was about to be bitter. Everybody knows the olive is bitter at the beginning. It's only after great pressure in the olive press that the oil is going to come out pure and taste good. You know, just bread dipped in olive oil is delicious. It's that good if you have good olive oil. And so praying in this place, you know, it says he starts sweating great drops of blood. He realizes that the oil that's going to come out of him in this press is going to be that human blood. He's going to be pressed to sacrifice in that way. But it would remind him of the dove going into the Garden of Eden, that the gates of Eden were going to open up, and then it's going to be able to bring that olive leaf as a reassurance back to Noah. And Yeshua says, as it was in the days of Noah, the time of the end is going to be like that. He's got a close connection with the days of Noah. Even walking on the water on the Sea of Galilee in the storm. Was that walking on the water or in the boat? The boat. Whichever time it was. There's one time where, if you read it in Hebrew, he says, nach, to the storm. That's the verb form of Noah. It's like, stop, rest, give it a rest here. So much of what he said did tie back to the flood and the judgments of the flood. But what he realizes, it's going to take the olive oil to power the holy menorah. It's, when we're talking about the Holy Spirit, it's especially for those of us stuck in this half-life. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then what it's going to take to purify us is going to be this olive oil, this crushing. That's what's going to power our holy menorah. That's what's going to allow the Holy Spirit to work freely in our lives. Because remember, if we're too rich, then we don't really have to suffer that much. Our physical security can prevent us from having to suffer too much. Although I'd say a lot of people who are wealthy or famous would disagree with that, because they do reach a point where they realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. But sacrifice is what's going to power this menorah. It's what's going to keep it burning, if that makes sense to you with the 10 virgin parable. Half of them had a measure of oil. Everybody has a measure, but half of them they had suffered enough to acquire the extra oil that would make it through the night until the bridegroom came. That's what it's telling you. They lived sacrificial lives. And without living a sacrificial life, when the tribulation comes, when the long night comes, when it seems like he delays, you may not last. You may not last. You may not have enough of that faith and the power of the Holy Spirit to power you on through until he actually comes. Excuse me. So we got a couple of scriptures here that's I'm going to explain it maybe. We're taking a walk down allergy lane today. It says, the word is a lamp. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. That's Psalm 119, 105. Proverbs 6:23 says, the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching, the Torah, is light, and reproofs for discipline are the way of life. And so to have that light, you have to suffer the reproofs of discipline. And that's tough, because we work hard, we put forth a lot of effort, and still it seems like the Father reproves us. Still it seems like the people around us want to reprove us and discipline us. And so we have to be discerning of that reproof and discipline and say, hey, wait a minute. Is, again, this just my own stupidity that brought this upon myself? If so, is he disciplining me in order to improve my ability to shine? And so taking the Torah in, we might think that's sacrifice enough, because it is going to make us different. We're not going to be able to do as many things as we used to do. But on the other hand, the sacrifice is much deeper and much more painful than we can imagine when it does come to giving up those things of ourself. Because at the same time, it's beautiful, it's a light, it's wonderful, it's a way of life. It's also a reproof of discipline. And that part of it can crush and press us. So the lamp is an equivalent to the word, and the word is an equivalent to the commandment of the Torah. So yes, the commandment, the mitzvah, is beautiful. Yes, it makes us into this lamp of the Holy Spirit, but at the very same time, there's a crushing that has to happen. What the commandment is going to do, and see, that's the difference. The Torah is light, but the commandment is the lamp. The lamp is going to focus the light. I've got light outside right now. That's just, in fact, I can't even see it with my naked eye. I can't really see those light rays. But if I want to focus the light in a dark place, then I'll use a lamp. I might use a headlamp. If I'm out camping, I might use a flashlight. If I'm in a dark room with no electricity, I will focus that light in. And the beauty of the lamp is it's the most functional in dark places. So we can take the Torah, which is light. It's the big picture. It's the 5 books. And we say, okay, just give me one commandment and that'll become a lamp. That will light up a dark place. Saying the Torah is light and beautiful is one thing. Obeying a commandment, that's going to cost you something. It'll cost you nothing to say the Torah is beautiful. It will cost you everything to obey a commandment. So with this focused light of the Torah in our lives to make us a lamp, it explains Revelation 1:20. As for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, the 7 assemblies, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, the 7 assemblies. So we look at the lampstand and we say, okay, yes, it's a lamp, but it's also people. It's the 7 Moedim, actually. They correspond to the 7 feasts. People assembling at the 7 feasts. So is it a menorah? Is it a lampstand? Or is it people? Yes. And then in Revelation 1:4, it says, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne. Okay, so that adds another level. Is this 7 lampstands? Is this 7 assemblies? Or is this the 7 spirits of Adonai? And the answer is still yes. Because if the spirit is in the assembly, represented by the lampstand, then all 3 are simultaneously true. But remember, he's threatening them. If you don't heed my warning, if you don't consider the height from which you have fallen, I will break off your lamp from the lampstand. I'll just break you off. You won't be part of it anymore. What is he saying? He's saying you're being disobedient. You're not moving in the power of the 7 spirits of Adonai. And so he's threatening here a discipline. So there's equivalency of expression here. The menorah is the Torah. It's the word. It's the commandment. It's the 7 spirits of God. It's the 7 assemblies. It can represent all of those things. I've seen a graphic that even showed how it represented the universe, or maybe the galaxy. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But if we just take an olive leaf, that's not going to produce any oil. It holds the promise of oil after we cultivate and after heavy crushing under the olive press. But that's what the dove's eyes saw. She saw this potential for a new world. And in spite of the bitterness, she takes that olive leaf and she returns with the message to Noah. What starts in bitterness can end in beauty. The beauty of the oil. One of the most beautiful passages in the Bible, it talks about how the oil that runs down Aaron's beard, the anointing oil, that's not how it starts out. It starts out with a tree. It starts out with years of cultivation. It starts out by picking olives in the hot sun, by separating them, by pressing them. There's so many steps to it that are sacrificial. But if you make those sacrifices, in the end, there is beauty. And this might explain Israel and how the rabbis are associating the dove with the last 10 tribes. They've been mixed among the nations for a purpose. They've been put out into the darkness for a purpose. Not to learn to take part in the darkness where they've been sent, but instead to restore the light through the pressure that's placed upon them. And that's why it just pains me sometimes to see how much effort and energy and time believers are throwing into stuff like conspiracy theories and complaining about the government. It's just like their day is consumed with worrying about politics and what's going on in the world, when they're supposed to be the light. This pressure is supposed to be squeezing more light out of them, because that's what the light does. In the lamp, it becomes useful in the dark. And if the light of the Torah is in us, then we should be a lamp in these dark places. We should be the place that's going to have a different message than just pure fear and anger. We have a different message. I took this picture several years ago in Israel. I can't remember the name of the location, but it was a cave. And it was an olive press. You can still see the indentations down where they would crush it, and then the oil would run into the indentations there. I'm not sure what you call those, channels, and then it would channel down where they could catch it. But you can see how dark it is in that cave. That's the beauty of the lamp. This olive press, as we are crushed in dark places, that's when we can really shine. This present plague that we're in, this present rebellion against everything divine that we're in, it's our opportunity to shine in these dark places. The Midrash goes on and elaborates about this. And it says Jewish people, but I would say believers. If believers were suffused with the Torah's lofty spirit, if they were living models of its wisdom, justice, and morality, if they radiated the joy and serenity that comes over anyone who takes refuge in God, then their shining example alone would have cast its glow upon the nations around them, and people from all backgrounds and races would be streaming to join us under the wings of God's presence. If this is not happening, then we are surely at fault, for it is a sign that we have been less than wholly faithful to our mission as God's people. And that's a tough discipline right there. It's an ancient tough discipline. These words were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But the same thing is true today. If we knew how to apply this principle of sacrifice like Yeshua did in the Olive Garden, then people would be racing to join us. They would see us shining in dark places and say, hey, what's going on here? The Jewish writings record that in temple times at the feasts, and this is related, I didn't change topics on you. I'm still on topic. no matter how many people were present in the temple courtyard, shoulder to shoulder. I mean, literally, if you can imagine it, they're in the temple courtyard and they're just smushed up against one another. They can't move. Nevertheless, when it was time to prostrate in prayer, it says there was plenty of room. It was a physical impossibility, but because of the spirit that they brought into the place, they were able to transcend physical impossibility. They were able to go beyond that half-life that we live and to take advantage of these holy spaces and how they will flex to open up. And then there's another piece of history that goes along with this. I think most of you have probably heard that before. I ran across another little shred in the same area. It says that, and it has to do with this supernatural carving of space during the time of the temple. In Pirkei Avot 5:5, it says, never did a man say to his fellow, the space is insufficient for me to stay overnight in Jerusalem. In other words, anyone who wanted to stay overnight in Jerusalem, no matter how full it already was, there was still room for one more, which I think that kind of meant that the city of Jerusalem had to kind of expand physically for that to happen. But nevertheless, if you wanted to worship in the temple, there would be a place for you, no matter what. And this little piece of history is what they dropped. They said during the rest of the year, if the synagogues of Jerusalem were already full, nevertheless, there was always room for any visitor who came. And they said, especially at the time of Shavuot, each of those synagogues, which were already full, they would swell with more than 300 additional worshipers in each one. And they said it was like a miracle in the temple where everybody's packed in there, but if it's time to pray and prostrate yourself, there's plenty of room. Well, they said that same miracle was happening in the synagogues when they welcomed visitors. And remember that passage in the book of James where he talks about receiving visitors into the synagogue and not being a respecter of person and making the rich person this wonderful place up front and then trying to hide the poor person in the back. And he says, these things ought not to be. God is no respecter of persons. Why should you be? Well, they said it at the time of Shavuot, these synagogues could swell with 300 additional worshipers because the rest of the year they would accommodate visitors. And they said it was a miracle just like that in the temple. And the message there is when you open your door to others, when you're hospitable, remember Abraham, he was known for his hospitality. You know, some of you probably have home fellowships and you think, oh my goodness, we really need a building. Well, you probably do, but don't worry. As long as you open your doors to others who are truly seeking, who are truly attracted to the light of the word, they see that light emanating from you. You know what? Your home fellowship will be sufficient until he gives you a building. It will supernaturally flex both in space and food. When it comes time for oneg, if it seems like there won't be enough food, there will be enough food. The key there, it says, open your doors to others. Jerusalem was known for its hospitality to these visitors who would come to worship at the temple. And they say, when Israel opens its doors to others like this, to those who want to come worship and to read the word, when they are that kind of light, when that kind of light starts going out of our gatherings, then others will be drawn to the light. And they say, when that happens, it's going to be a miracle of such a high degree that it's the time of the third redemption. When we are that hospitable to one another, to those who want to come worship and delve into the word, when we start opening our doors to that extent that we start creating Well, we're not creating them, but we initiate an obedience and an attitude where holy spaces just open up. And we don't have any idea how there was enough food to feed everybody. We don't have any idea how everybody got into that house and had a place to sit down. We don't know. We don't know how this ministry functioned without enough money, but it functioned. Those are the sorts of miracles that will happen, it says, when we live these lives of sacrifice like the dove. The palace of Messiah is thought to be in the Garden of Eden, in the third heaven. And it's called Kansipur, or the bird nest. So you can see why there is such a close relationship between the land of Israel and the physical realm, and then the garden that hovers just above it. It says like the days of heaven on earth. Because you're so close to that realm, there's a higher obligation. You're very close to the bird nest when you're in Israel. And then it gives this final analogy between the dove and the people of Israel. It says there is a type of dove that they feed it, and then its fellows smell it and come to it in its nest. Similarly, when a teacher sits and teaches, many people convert at that time. In other words, they have a transformation. And it cites Isaiah 29:23 in this context, when he sees his children. And it says, what is written after those words? Those of a misguided spirit will attain understanding. And so to kind of decode what's happening here, smell, the sense of smell, reach, an odor, it's the same root there as ruach, which is spirit. The dove's eyes, the eyes have to do with the spirit. So both of these, the dove's eyes and this special food they're talking about that you can give to this particular type of dove, when they feed it, it emits an odor, it emits a spirit. Its eyes are like spirit. And so the food that they're feeding to this dove, this special type of dove, it's like it creates an odor of attraction. It's like a spiritual, what's it, a pheromone? Except it's not for reproduction in that sense, it's for spiritual reproduction. That the odor that's emitted from this particular type of dove, it will attract others, and they will go back to the nest with that dove. And then the teacher can sit and teach. Now, if you'll match that with the end of last night's lesson, where it says, what happens in the fourth period of the day? We know what happens in the first three. We have that tradition. You know, we have the Torah, we have the judgment, we have the mercy, and then what happens? Well, he says that's when the children are taught. And so when we are radiating this light, this spirit of the Torah, when we're emitting this light of hospitality, then there's some sort of odor. What we're eating the word. We're eating the seed of the word. When we do that, when we internalize it, then it's just like a perfume. It's like a spiritual pheromone coming off of us, and people will start following us around. They'll be attracted to it. And it says many can convert. We can lead people to salvation. They'll come back with us to Yeshua's nest, to his palace in the garden. If they're already saved, then they can undergo these transformations of the word. You have many transformations of the word if you're growing in him. And it's the particular type of dove that's the catalyst for these things to happen, to bring people to meet their Messiah and to allow that word to change their lives. So just to summarize, if Israel were feeding on the word and practicing the mitzvot with joy in their suffering from its bitter leaves, the world would notice and they would flock to nest with them so that they could also feed on the word in Messiah's palace. And no matter how many assembled, if we look at Jerusalem described four square in Revelation, no matter how many were assembled in there, it's going to hold them. There's no point in trying to physically calculate and say how many people could the holy city possibly hold. It's not that kind of place. It will flex. Holy spaces will flex. So no matter how many were to assemble at the nest, there would always be room for worshiping the Holy One. And that's kind of a mystery of space. When we make room for one another, that's when the holy spaces will flex, and they'll make room for everyone who wants to assemble. Pretty cool. So here's a picture I took at Hebron, which, remember, they believe the tradition was that this was an entrance back to the garden, and that's why Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah are buried there. And so I was at the area there over Sarah's tomb at Hebron, and I looked up and there's the birds again. I seem to see everywhere. And they've actually had made a nest up at the top there in that little cubicle that's over Sarah's tomb. And that's also at Hebron, a little white dove that somebody pointed out to me.